Al Capone may have ruled Chicago. Lucky Luciano controlled New York City. But Harlem belonged to one man, Bumpy Johnson. In the first half of the 20th century, he exchanged gunfire with mafia bosses, protected the Queen of Harlem in the lucrative numbers business when the mob wanted in, and built a heroin empire that they could never fully infiltrate. That defiance earned him a nickname he fully deserved, the Godfather of Harlem. In 2019, a television series took that title and cast Forrest Whitaker in the role, a brilliant performance in a compelling show, and as depicted in the show, if you wanted to open a bar in Harlem, you went through Bumpy. If you wanted to sell heroin on its streets, you went through Bumpy. For a time, even the New York Mafia itself couldn't conduct business in Harlem without going through Bumpy. First, after he ran them out. But before his rise to becoming the Godfather of Harlem, he started at the very bottom. And this is the full story of the rise of Bumpy Johnson, the real Godfather of Harlem. Bumpy Johnson was born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson on October the 31st, 1905 in the historic port city of Charleston, South Carolina, a coastal community on the Atlantic shoreline known for its busy harbor and old southern neighborhoods. He was the youngest of 7 children born to William and Margaret Johnson, a working-class couple who raised their family in a modest 3-bedroom house at the now-demolished 123 Bogard Street, a narrow residential block on the city's west side in the neighborhood of Canra. It was an old wooden house, barely large enough for a small family, let alone 7 children, but it was the center of the Johnson household. In that cramped front bedroom with siblings waiting anxiously beyond the door, the attending midwife noticed a small bump on the back of the newborn's head. It was a harmless deformity, she assured an exhausted Margaret, and she explained it was just a minor mark from a difficult labor. The reassurance eased the moment, but the detail remained. And before long, the family began referring to the child simply as Bumpy, a nickname born on the day of his arrival, and one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Bumpy's parents, of whom no surviving photographs remain, were working people living within the narrow limits of what Charleston could offer a black family at the turn of the century. With another child now added to the household, the pressure to keep the family fed only intensified. William Johnson was typically up before first light, slipping out of the small wooden house and heading down towards the docks. There he boarded an aging fishing boat and traveled along the Ashley River in search of oysters, shrimp, or herring. The work was long and grueling, and most days he labored from sunrise to sunset on nothing more than the plain breakfast of grits or cornbread that his wife Margaret prepared while the rest of the children were still asleep. In the evenings, the day's catch was sold along Charleston's waterfront, and William returned home with whatever remained after settling accounts with the white owner of the boat. This type of arrangement was typical for black fishermen in the Jim Crow South. Very few black men owned boats outright. Instead, they worked under systems that resembled sharecropping, only on water. The white owners supplied the vessel, the nets, and the license, and the black fishermen supplied the labor. At the end of each day, the catch was divided according to whatever terms the owner dictated, usually leaving the fishermen with just enough to survive, but never enough to advance. When rough weather made fishing impossible, William turned instead to the harbor, taking whatever work he could find, hauling crates, carrying travelers' luggage, or loading and unloading warehouses along the Wolves. For a man in his circumstances, coming home with nothing simply was not an option. Margaret Johnson's days followed a steady and familiar rhythm, shaped by long hours and the never-ending demands of a large household. She was always the first to rise, preparing breakfast for her husband before he left for the docks, and then turning her attention to her children, particularly the younger ones, who needed help dressing and organizing themselves for school. Once the house was in order and the children were sent on their way, she left to work in the wealthier white neighborhoods, where she spent her days scrubbing floors, washing and folding linens, and minding children whose parents were away at work. The pay was modest yet reliable, and some employers allowed her to bring her eldest daughters to assist with the lighter chores, easing the burden a little. When work in Charleston grew scarce, Margaret followed the path that so many Southern black women took in search of steadier employment. She boarded an Atlantic coastline train, the main rail route running up the eastern seaboard, and traveled through Virginia and Washington before eventually reaching New York. The journey was long and tiring, but the wages in New York City were considerably better, and over time she brought two of her eldest daughters, Margaret Jr. and Mabel, to join her. Together, they secured steadier employment as cleaners in the city, and before long, it became clear that New York offered them firmer ground than anything waiting back home, something that Bumpy would come to learn for himself soon enough. In the spring of 1908, Margaret returned home to find her eldest daughter, Priscilla, seriously unwell. The child had spent the day feverish and vomiting, unable to keep any food down. And one look at her sunken eyes and dry, cracked lips told Margaret that this was no ordinary sickness. Priscilla laid weak and subdued, her breathing shallow, too drained to even cry. With William still down at the docks, the responsibility fell to Margaret, and Margaret alone. She acted quickly, knowing there was little time to spare. Whatever options existed could be considered later, but for the moment, getting her daughter to a hospital was the only thing that mattered. South Carolina, like much of the South, operated under Jim Crow laws, and its hospitals reflected the strict color line of the time. Public facilities from schools and restaurants to trains and medical institutions were segregated, and white physicians often refused to treat black patients. The few hospitals designated for African Americans were typically underfunded, poorly equipped, and housed in aging buildings. Black doctors denied access to white teaching hospitals, and their residency programs often lacked the advanced training available to their white counterparts, relying instead on apprenticeships, with the rare white physician willing to teach them. Margaret's only option was Cannon Street Hospital, the sole medical facility in Charleston that treated African American patients. It stood at 135 Cannon Street, just a short distance from the Johnson home on Bogard Street. She carried Priscilla there as quickly as she could, hoping that reaching the hospital in time might save her daughter's life. By the time a doctor finally examined the child, Priscilla was drifting in and out of consciousness, her lips tinged blue from the lack of oxygen. The physician suspected that she contracted a severe infection, likely from contaminated water, but the diagnosis came far too late for meaningful treatment. Cannon Street Hospital did what it could, but it was a small, underfunded facility with limited staff and minimal equipment. A stark contrast to the white hospitals across town, which were better funded, better supplied, and staffed by more experienced doctors. Margaret remained at her daughter's bedside as Priscilla's breathing grew weaker, and in those final hours she confronted a reality that countless black families faced in the Jim Crow South, that a child's chance of survival could hinge on the color of her skin and the limits of where she was allowed to seek treatment. Despite everything Margaret and the doctors could do, Priscilla died on the night of April the 14th, 1908, just 13 years old. The loss devastated the Johnson household. And for young Bumpy, even at just 2 years old, the story of how his sister died and how different the outcome might have been under a white doctor's care became one of the earliest injustices impressed upon him. It was a wound that shaped not only the family's grief, but his own emerging sense of the world and the equalities carved into it. In the years that followed, the household tried to steady itself, but the absence of Priscilla remained a constant, unspoken presence. By 1915, Bumpy Johnson was 10 years old, and like many boys his age, he watched his older brother Willie with a mixture of admiration and awe. Willie, of whom no photograph survived, like the rest of the Johnson family, was already 19 and carried himself with the restless energy of someone who refused to bow to any kind of authority. His temper was quick, and he had a reputation for getting into fights. A dangerous habit for a black man in the Jim Crow South, where even a small act of resistance, such as holding a white man's gaze a moment too long after being called boy, could carry serious consequences. Willie's defiant streak, as troubling as it was, came with a certain influence over his younger brother. He spoke to Bumpy in a way he rarely did with their parents, voicing his frustrations about race, dignity, and the everyday injustices that governed life in the South. Whether he meant it or not, Willie was giving Bumpy an early understanding of the world around him, an introduction to the inequalities that shaped their lives, and the beginnings of the attitude that Bumpy would carry with him into adulthood. One night, those inequalities that Willie faced boiled over, leading to an incident that would change his younger brother's life forever. Willie burst through the front door of the Johnson household in a state of panic, his clothes damp with sweat, fear written plainly across his face. As he tried to steady his breathing, his parents pieced together what happened. A heated exchange had escalated, and in a moment of anger, Willie had struck a white man. The man had fallen, failed to rise, and was believed to be dead. Word traveled quickly through Charleston, and the Johnsons knew at once what that meant. There would be no hearing, no investigation, and no chance for Willie to explain himself. In the Jim Crow South, such an accusation allowed only one outcome. A mob would come and their son would be publicly lynched. The family acted with urgency. Under the cover of night, they moved Willie through the back streets of Charleston towards Union Station, the same terminal Margaret and his older sisters had used years earlier, when traveling north along the Atlantic coastline. A porter, an acquaintance of a family friend, met them on the platform and hid Willie beneath bales of cotton and tobacco on a discreet northbound ACL freight carriage. Moments later, the train pulled out of East Bay Street, heading first towards Florence, then continuing up the eastern seaboard through Virginia and Washington before carrying him on to New York City and whatever future he could find there. By the time the authorities arrived at the Johnson home, Willie was already hundreds of miles away beyond Charleston's reach and the mob that would have been waiting for him. In the hours after Willie fled the city, a vicious manhunt swept through Charleston. Groups of white men gathered with rifles, lanterns, and pitchforks, searching the streets and the marshland beyond the railroad tracks for any trace of him. They questioned neighbors, lingered outside the Johnson home, and combed through the back alleys where Willie had once wandered as a boy. His father, William Johnson, held a position that afforded him a touch of quiet influence as treasurer of the Negro Federation Bank at 218 Phillips Street. He was accustomed to dealing with local officials and navigating the city's financial networks. Drawing on those connections and perhaps on the funds that he could access only because of his role at the bank, William managed to reach the right desk inside the city police headquarters on the northwest corner of Vanderhorst and Street Phillips Streets. There he secured an unspoken arrangement. The search would be called off if the family could make an appropriate payment. Now, William's role of treasurer was only a voluntary position, so the price of that bargain became the mortgage placed on their home. A crushing burden for a working family, but one that gave the Johnsons peace, as the lynch mob would eventually come for the rest of the family if they couldn't find Willie. The house was sold, and the Johnsons lived in relative peace. But Willie's sudden disappearance left a noticeable emptiness in Bumpy's life, and the financial strain placed on the family by Willie's debt only sharpened the anger forming inside him. An anger that 4 years later, at the age of 14, was beginning to surface just as much as Willie's had. It was at this moment, with Bumpy already carrying the weight of his brother's absence, that Charleston was shaken by racial violence. In May 1919, 5 white sailors accused a black man of cheating them, and when they failed to find him, they turned their fury on African Americans at random. Within hours, a mob of sailors and white civilians, nearly 1,000 strong, swept through the streets, attacking black residents, damaging businesses, and invading homes. Like every black family, the Johnsons barricaded themselves inside, listening to the chaos taking place outside. Bumpy, however, had to be physically restrained by his parents. He was desperate to join the few black residents who were putting up a fight. The unrest that began in Charleston soon echoed across the country, erupting into a wave of racial violence that became known as the Red Summer. In Chicago, mobs stormed black neighborhoods and set homes ablaze. In Washington, D.C., white servicemen roamed the streets assaulting black residents. And in Arkansas, The Elaine massacre left around 200 black residents dead and became the deadliest racial conflict in the history of the United States. Across each city, lynchings rose sharply, and violence spread with little intervention from local authorities. The Red Summer only deepened Bumpy's distaste for white authority. His parents watched his reactions with mounting concern, his refusal to call white men sir, his insistence on staying on the sidewalk rather than stepping aside, and his increasingly outspoken defiance placed him in constant danger. Charleston was unforgiving towards black boys who challenged its rules, and the Johnson knew, like his brother Willie, that the city would not grant him many chances. They knew that keeping him in Charleston, in a city governed by Jim Crow, the system of segregation that policed every word, gesture, and glance between black people and whites, where a boy's life could be decided by a look or a step out of place, was no longer tenable. By contrast, they had heard enough from Mabel and Margaret Jr. to know that New York offered a different kind of life. Margaret Sr. had also spent a considerable amount of time in New York City and had seen how, over the past few years, black families from across the South had been pouring into the city, and Harlem was rapidly becoming the center of that migration, a place of work, culture, ambition, and possibility. It was a world utterly unlike the one he was growing up in, a world where a young black man could walk the streets without the constant threat of racial violence shaping every step. And thus, Bumpy was sent to the Big Apple. In December 1919, Bumpy began the long journey that would carry him from Charleston to Harlem. He traveled north along the Atlantic coastline, the same route his sisters and his brother Willie had taken before him, changing trains in Washington, D.C. Before continuing towards New York, by late afternoon, he stepped onto the platform at Penn Station on 7th Avenue, surrounded by the noise and movement of Manhattan for the very first time. From there, he followed the crowds down into the subway, riding the line north towards 125th Street in Harlem, where his sister Mabel was waiting to meet him. He was exhausted, hungry, and worn down by the miles behind him. Yet the anticipation of seeing Harlem for the first time pushed aside every single discomfort. The neighborhood that was unfolding before him was unlike anything he had ever known. Instead of the wooden houses and quiet streets of Charleston, Harlem rose upward in long rows of brownstone apartments and tightly packed tenements stitched together by elevated train tracks that curved overhead. The streets vibrated with movement, the blare of car horns, the rumble of streetcars, and the calls of vendors and newspaper boys cutting through the noise of the streets. But Harlem had not always been this way. 2 centuries earlier, when New York was still the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, settlers claimed the northern reaches of Manhattan and named the area New Harlem after the Dutch city that they had left behind. For generations, it remained farmland, rolling meadows and country estates owned by prominent Dutch families like the Dijkmans and the Bleekers. Even after the British arrived and anglicized its name, Harlem remained a quiet northern outpost. During the American Revolution, the Battle of Harlem Heights was fought across its fields, a rare early victory for George Washington's troops. During the 19th century, the farmland gave way to boulevards, and Harlem became a suburban enclave for New York's white middle class. Grand brownstones lined its streets. Churches and schools filled its blocks. By the turn of the century, Jewish, Irish, and Italian families lived there in growing numbers. But overbuilding and speculation outpaced demand. When the subway reached 145th Street in 1904, developers found themselves sitting on empty, unsold apartments, and in desperation, they opened their doors to black tenants, often at inflated rates. What began as a financial calculation soon transformed the entire neighborhood. Middle-class black families, teachers, doctors, artists, and laborers began moving into homes once reserved for the city's elite, reshaping Harlem into the heart of black America. Between 1910 and 1920, this transformation accelerated as more than 1 million black Southerners fled poverty, lynching, and Jim Crow in what became known as the Great Migration. They boarded trains at midnight, with battered suitcases following rumors of steady work in Chicago, Detroit, and New York, chasing the promise of dignity and wages unavailable in the South. By the time that Bumpy arrived in 1919, Harlem was already swelling with new arrivals, each seeking the same elusive promise, a life lived without fear. That year also marked the return of the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry Regiment, Harlem's own World War I unit. On February the 17th, New York held a victory parade unlike anything the city had ever seen. Tens of thousands lined Fifth Avenue as the regiment marched home from Europe, led by dancer Bojangles Robinson. These were men who had spent 191 consecutive days in the front-line trenches of France, more than any other American unit. Rejected by white officers at home, they fought under the French army, wearing French helmets and carrying French rifles through Champagne and the Argonne Forest. The French called them Hommes de Bronze, the men of bronze, and the Germans called them Hohenkämpfer, the Hell Fighters. When they crossed into Germany, they became the first Allied regiment to reach enemy soil. Harlem saw them not just as soldiers, but as symbols, living proof that black courage and discipline could no longer be denied. Yet recognition faded quickly. Many returned to a neighborhood where opportunity remained scarce, where veterans who had survived machine gun fire now worked as porters, cooks and butlers for white men who had never fought. Ministers, teachers, and professionals faced the same barriers. Banks, offices, and city agencies refused to hire them. Tenements overflowed, and whole families lived in single rooms. But out of the despair, a new energy began to form. A rising insistence on dignity and cultural pride. Writers, musicians, activists, and veterans alike started speaking of a new Negro, confident, outspoken, and unwilling to settle for second-class treatment. This was the Harlem that Bumpy stepped into, a place shaped by struggle, brilliance, frustration, and possibility, a neighborhood alive with ambition and defiance. In that moment, Bumpy understood that he had entered a different world. New York offered possibilities that Charleston never allowed him to imagine. Here, a black man could dream without apology. And as he followed Mabel through the streets towards her apartment, Bumpy made a quiet promise to himself. In this new city, he would make a name, one defined not by fear or limitation, but by the confidence he felt for the first time as he walked through Harlem. Mabel's apartment was on the corner of 150th Street and 7th Avenue, a crossroads that sat deep in the heart of Harlem's expanding community. The building itself was a weathered brownstone that had long since been divided into several small units, each one occupied by black families who had come north in search of opportunity. Inside, the familiar signs of crowded city life filled the halls, children's voices echoing up the stairwell, mothers calling after restless youngsters, and the mix of cooking smells drifted from kitchens behind thin walls, blending into the warm, lived-in atmosphere of the place. When Bumpy stepped inside his sister's apartment, the space felt even smaller. The living room, which was soon to double as his sleeping area, was cramped with an old couch occupying its center and children's books and toys scattered across a worn wooden bookshelf. Mabel introduced him to her children, pointed out where he could place his belongings, and with a gentle practicality told him, "You'll sleep on the couch. I'll get you a blanket and some sheets after dinner." That night, despite a long journey and the stiffness in his limbs, Bumpy found it difficult to settle. The apartment that now served as his home felt cramped and worn, and the lumpy couch he lay on seemed a poor match for the up-and-coming Harlem that he had just walked through. Compared to the outside world, the room around him felt like a temporary stop rather than a destination, and as he shifted against uneven cushions, his thoughts turned to his other sister, Margaret Jr. He remembered very little about her because she'd left Charleston when he was only 3. But their mother often spoke of her, sharing news from the letters she sent home. From those stories, Bumpy knew she lived alone, worked full-time, and attended night classes at the Pratt Institute. Her life sounded steadier, and perhaps even more in line with the Harlem that he had imagined. As he stared at the ceiling, Tired but unable to drift off, he made a quiet mental note to ask Mabel for Margaret's address, wondering if somewhere in this vast city perhaps a better room might be waiting for him. In the weeks that followed, Bumpy did his best to adjust to life in Harlem. Seeing how hard Mabel worked to keep the household going, cleaning downtown for long hours and stretching every dollar, he suggested finding a job to help with expenses and perhaps sending a little money back home. But Mabel refused the idea outright. A boy his age belonged in school, she insisted, and she worried about how it would look if people thought that she needed her younger brother to work. It was decided then that Bumpy would enroll at Public School 119 on West 139th Street, only a short walk from the apartment. However, the thought of school worried Bumpy. Settling into the neighborhood had already shown its challenges. To many Harlem children, he looked like an outsider, a small framed boy from South Carolina who seemed at first glance like an easy target. But Bumpy was tougher than he appeared, and the local boys would learn that quickly for the students of PS 119. That lesson arrived on day one. On his first morning of school, Bumpy set off wearing second-hand blue trousers, a white shirt, and a bright red bow tie that Mabel had carefully pressed the night before. She'd given him a few pennies for his lunch, and he kept his hand firmly in his pocket as he walked, determined not to lose the small coins that meant so much. He was only 2 blocks from the school when he noticed a group of 6 older boys crowded against a building, shooting dice and trading jabs, with excited, competitive energy of boys absorbed in a game. Curious, he slowed his pace, drawn in by their laughter, and the boys spotted him immediately. One of them, irritated by a losing streak, muttered that the country boy might be carrying money that they could take off him. A boy known only as 6 and 8 stepped forward, seized Bumpy's arm, and demanded, "Hey, you country, what do you have in your pocket?" Bumpy met his gaze without hesitation. "My hand? Why got a problem with that?" he replied. His voice was steady, and the boy tightened his grip. "Take your hand out and show me what else is there." "You don't want me to take my hand out," Bumpy shot back, "because if I do, I'll smash it against your head." The exchange caught the attention of the entire group. The mood shifted. One of them stepped forward, holding $2 bills, and he said, "I bet 6 and 8 kills, that boy. Anybody want to take that bet?" A boy named Nat, who had been watching quietly, shook his head, and he said, "No, you know what? I'm going with the country boy. I have a feeling about him." 6 struck first, aiming a sucker punch meant to end the fight before it began. But Bumpy slipped the blow with a sharp backward lean, the hook skimming past his chin, and in that moment he pulled his hand from his pocket and stepped forward, driving a clean punch straight into the center of 6's face. The impact broke the older boy's nose, and a second blow followed instantly, catching him at the temple and sending him sideways. Reeling and desperate, 6 grabbed at Bumpy's trousers. Copper coins spilled across the sidewalk and clattered beneath the boy's feet. His knees buckled. Bumpy pressed the advantage, landing sharp kicks to 6's stomach as he lay on the ground, each strike drawing louder cries from the gathering crowd. Sensing the fight was turning brutal, the others rushed in and dragged Bumpy back before he could deliver more damage. There was no time to argue over the outcome because a truant officer appeared at the end of the block and the boys scattered in every direction. Bumpy had no chance to savor the victory, but the effect was immediate. The boys who had viewed him as a quiet outsider from the South now regarded him with new respect. That first-day fight marked the beginning of friendships that would shape his early years in Harlem. The group he had stumbled into was a small band of neighborhood boys, loosely organized, but already developing the instincts and loyalties of a street gang. Among them, 2 of the boys stood out to Bumpy. Nat Pettigrew, sharp-eyed and even-tempered, was quick to recognize Bumpy's grit, and Jameson, Junie Bird, wiry and restless, carried the energy of a boy determined to make something of himself in a crowded city. Together, they became the core of the crew that Bumpy would soon run with. Bumpy never returned to school after that first day. Instead, each morning he slipped out of Mabel's apartment and met up with Nat, Junie, and the others. boys who had already become his closest companions. They made small amounts of money any way they could, hustling pool, shooting dice, or selling newspapers on busy corners. The earnings were meager, but Bumpy held on to the hope that with enough hustling, he might send something home to help his parents with the mortgage debt back in Charleston. Around the same time that the boys began slipping away from school, the country was being reshaped by Prohibition. In January 1920, the Volstead Act made the manufacturing sale of alcohol illegal across the United States. But in places like Harlem, the law had an almost opposite effect, with legal saloons forced to close, informal speakeasies, secret drinking rooms where patrons whispered passwords at unmarked doors began to flourish. They appeared in barber shops, basements, cafes, and rented apartments, each one offering the kind of freedom, music, and liquor that Prohibition tried and failed to suppress. 7th Avenue and Lenox Avenue, already busy commercial streets, quickly became the center of this hidden nightlife. For a neighborhood crowded with new arrivals from the South, Prohibition created opportunities, small, precarious, and often illegal, that the boys, like Bumpy, could sense even before they fully understood them. Their first opportunity was when the owner of the Nassau Cafe on the corner of 7th Avenue on West 32nd Street offered them free meals in exchange for sweeping the sidewalk outside his establishment and keep an eye out for Prohibition agents. The Nassau was a cafe and a restaurant by day, but operated as a speakeasy in the basement by night. 7th Avenue, humming with traffic and dotted with these early speakeasies, was the ideal place for boys like Bumpy and his crew who were trying to carve out a little space of their own. They accepted immediately, and before long, the restaurant became their regular meeting place. Each morning they gathered there, swept the front walk, ate their breakfast, and planned out the day ahead. Discovering how easy it was, they soon began sweeping sidewalks for other Harlem businesses as well, earning a few more coins wherever they could. For a boy who had struggled to adapt in those early months, Harlem slowly began to suit Bumpy. In the first few years of the Roaring Twenties, the neighborhood shaped him as surely as he was learning to navigate it. His natural alertness and quick instincts helped him move through the streets with ease, and with the support of his sharp, streetwise friends, he learned how money flowed from one corner to the next. What began as simple work, sweeping and keeping lookout for local business owners, running errands, or carrying packages, gradually gave way to more profitable ventures. Gambling, petty theft, and small hustles provided a steady stream of cash, giving Bumpy his first real taste of Harlem money, and he found himself wanting more. His style began to change as well. He adopted the sharp, flashy look that defined the neighborhood, blending confidence with the ambition that was beginning to take root inside him. It wasn't long before Bumpy, who had now naturally taken leadership of the crew, began organizing more ambitious schemes with Nat and Junie Bird at his side. Together, they started offering protection to the new shops, opening up along Lenox and 7th Avenue. Store owners uneasy about the rise in vandalism, petty robbery, and street trouble were willing to pay for the promise of security. The irony understood by the boys, and not the shop owner, was that the real danger often came from the very boys providing that protection. Those who refused quickly learned the consequences. It was a simple, calculated form of extortion, still adolescent in scale, but already recognized as part of doing business in Harlem. It was in the summer of 1923 that 18-year-old Bumpy first crossed paths with Bub Hewlett, a moment that carried far more weight than he realized at the time. In Harlem, the name Bub Hewlett traveled ahead of the man himself. To shopkeepers, gamblers, hustlers, and anyone who made their living along Lenox Avenue, he was spoken of with a mixture of fear and begrudging respect. People lowered their voices when they mentioned him. Even the older men on the corners, the ones who claimed nothing ever rattled them, kept their eyes sharp whenever Bob passed, because Bub Hewlett was at that time the most feared figure in Harlem. Born in Manchester, Virginia in 1888, he had come north during the early years of the Great Migration and spent the next 2 decades carving out a brutal niche in Manhattan's underworld. To bankers themselves, the rewards were extraordinary. By the early 1920s, Harlem's major policy banks were grossing around $35,000 a day, which was roughly $750,000 in today's money. Men like Caspar Holstein, Joe E., and Willie Brund became known as policy kings. Living in luxury, driving Packards and Cadillacs, wearing diamonds, and quietly investing their fortunes into Harlem's new nightclubs and apartment buildings. In the summer of 1923, news reached Bub Hewlett that a new policy operation had opened inside the Street Charles building on West 148th Street. It was small, independent, and ran by a man named Martin Harris, a cautious operator of whom no photographs have survived. The storefront posed as a modest grocery, the kind of place that sold flour, beans, and canned goods to families in the surrounding blocks, but word on Lenox Avenue said otherwise. Behind the sacks of rice and stacked tins, Harris was apparently running a brand-new numbers bank. Bob went there in person to offer, or rather demand, his protection. What he didn't know was that Bumpy and his crew had arrived first. They had heard only that a new grocery store was opening, and went there, hoping to offer the owner the same protection they'd been selling up and down Lenox and 7th Avenue. But the moment they stepped inside, they realized the place wasn't a grocery store at all, because Harris barely looked up from the slips on his desk and told them plainly that Bub Hewlett would be along shortly to arrange protection. It was said so casually, as though Bub's authority was absolute and unquestionable, that Nat and Junie exchanged a glance. Bumpy, however, didn't flinch. If Bub expected to walk in and claim the place, he would find he was not the first to get there. When Bob arrived, he walked in the office, expecting a routine shakedown. He introduced himself, explained how things worked, and Harris listened calmly before telling Bob that he was already paying for protection. Bob laughed and asked, "Who?" Harris nodded towards the window and said, "He's outside." Bob turned round, leaned against the glossy fender of his black Lincoln. Was a teenager, slim, sharply dressed, with Nat Pettigrew and Junie Bird over his shoulders. Bumpy met Bub's stare without a trace of fear. Bob stormed out the shop. "Get off my car," he said. "Do you know who I am?" Bumpy stepped off the bumper, dusted his sleeve, and replied calmly, "Yeah, I know. You're Bub Hewlett. Good. Now that I'm off your car, you can get off my block." Bob's face tightened. "How is this your block?" "Because me and my boys claimed it," Bumpy said. "We came here first. This store is ours." For a moment, the street fell silent. Then, slowly, a grin crept across Bob's face. Not anger, but recognition. "I get it," he said. "Youngsters need their own start, as long as they show respect. How about this? You give me a piece of what you make, and you can keep this spot. We'll call it a partnership." Bumpy nodded once. "Fine. We do our pickups on Sunday mornings. You come and collect your share. And since we're partners, you'll cut us in on some of yours." Bob laughed, a deep knowing laugh from a man not easily impressed. He left more amused than offended, and struck by the nerve of a boy who should have been terrified. Bob would later admit that in that moment, beneath the roaring 20s accelerated, Harlem became the epicenter of illegal liquor and late-night entertainment in New York City. The neighborhood pulsed with energy, drawing people from every corner of the country. Its nightlife especially exerted a powerful pull. Night after night, white patrons, wealthy, famous, or simply curious, poured uptown in expensive cars, seeking the thrill of Harlem's nightclubs, speakeasies, cabarets, and brothel hidden behind unassuming storefronts. Jimmy Durante, Charlie Chaplin, Sid Grauman, James Cagney, Bette Davis, Marlene Dietrich, all made the trip to experience the neighborhood's most famous attraction, the Cotton Club. The club, once known as the Club Deluxe, had been purchased in 1922 by gangster Owney the Killer Madden from former heavyweight champion Jack Johnson. Madden transformed it into a lavish, white-only venue decorated with white tablecloths, glittering chandeliers, and murals depicting cotton fields. Under its new name, the Cotton Club, it quickly became Harlem's premier destination. The city's greatest black performers electrified its stage. Cab Calloway, Louis Armstrong, Lena Horne, Ethel Waters, and Florence Mills all dazzled the audience, even though none were allowed to sit among them when the show ended. The club thrived at the same moment that the Harlem Renaissance reached its peak. Across the neighborhood, writers, thinkers, and artists were giving voice to a new cultural confidence. The very spirit people had begun calling the new Negro when Bumpy first arrived in Harlem 4 years earlier. Back then, it had been little more than a phrase he overheard in barber shops and cafes. But by 1923, it had grown into a movement, reshaping the neighborhood's identity. Langston Hughes scribbled early verses on cafe napkins, capturing the depth of ancestral memory in the weight of deferred dreams. Zora Neale Hurston gathered Southern folk tales and preserved the cadences of a people whose stories had long been overlooked. County Cullen and Claude McKay filled journals and newspapers with poems and essays demanding dignity and equality. And in salons and quiet living rooms, W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke debated philosophy, art, and race, refining Locke's influential vision of what the new Negro could and should be. Music was the movement's pulse. From the Cotton Club to Small's Paradise, a bustling black-owned nightclub on 135th Street, where the lights never dimmed and the dancing often lasted until dawn. From crowded rent parties to the corners of Lenox Avenue, jazz carried Harlem's heartbeat. It was a sound that felt both improvisational and purposeful, matching the determination of a community unwilling to be silenced. Trumpets, pianos, laughter, police whistles, sermons, and shouts blended into a soundtrack that defined daily life. Visual artists added their voices as well. Painters like Aaron Douglas infused bold, modernist forms with the rhythms of jazz and the history of black identity, creating murals that would come to symbolize the era. Photographers like James Van Der Zee captured Harlem's many contradictions, the pride and poverty, elegance and exhaustion, through striking black and white portraits that remain defining images of the period. Harlem's underground economy was thriving as well, and no operation was more profitable than the numbers game, which was now pulling in fortunes every single day. Caspar Holstein was, without question, the biggest policy banker in Harlem. The man who had single-handedly revived the numbers game after it briefly fell out of favor in the neighborhood before Bumpy's arrival. By 1923, his earnings exceeded $12,000 a day, the equivalent of roughly $220,000 in today's money, and his influence stretched across Harlem like an invisible empire. To many, Harlem, he represented the pinnacle of what the numbers racket could offer: wealth, respectability, and the kind of power that no legitimate institution had ever granted a black man. Known simply as the Bolito King, Holstein operated from his elegant turf club at 111 West 136th Street, a discreet headquarters where runners, writers, and bankers came and went under his watchful eye. Big Joe Eisen ran the second busiest spot at 251 West 125th Street, right beside the Apollo Theater, clearing as much as $10,000 a day from nickel-and-dime bets. Further downtown, Henry Miro, a Puerto Rican labor-turned-banker, ran his operation out of 157 West 117th Street, whilst his trusted enforcer, a sharp West Indian named Wilfred Willie Brunder, handled collections before breaking away to start his own bank up on 357 Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill, catering to the city's black elite who wanted a discreet taste of the numbers. And over on 212 7th Avenue, Alex Pompezes, a respected businessman and baseball executive, managed his own policy empire from his cigar shop, in the same streets where poets read their verses, and jazz spilled out of basement clubs, envelopes of bets changed hands, runners dashed between storefront banks, and armed guards watched doorways with practiced vigilance. Culture and crime existed side by side, each feeding off the energy of the age. By 1924, Bumpy was 19 years old and already firmly established on the streets of Harlem, handsome, sharply dressed, and quick with both his mind and his hands. He carried a switchblade and a pistol wherever he went. Their constant presence a reflection of the life that he had chosen. His reflexes were legendary amongst the boys who ran with him, but to keep their heads, Bumpy and his boys fit the bill. Their reputation for loyalty and efficiency spread quickly, and soon their services were in high demand. One of their earliest assignments, arranged through Bub, was to provide protection for Alex Pompez, one of Harlem's most prominent and least violent policy bankers. Pompez was a soft-spoken, intelligent man whose true passion was baseball. Having earned millions in the numbers racket, he was attempting to move his wealth into legitimate ventures and had recently purchased two teams, the Cuban Eastern Stars of the Eastern Colored League and the New York Cubans of the Negro League. He was also playing a key role in organizing the first Negro League World Series in 1924. It was this assignment, meant to be routine and respectable, that led to Bumpy Johnson's first major encounter with the law and ultimately his first trip to jail. One evening in 1924, Bumpy and Nat were escorting Alex Pompez to a house in Spanish Harlem when a gunman confronted them, demanding the banker's money. The holdup was over almost as soon as it began, because with a single, swift motion, Bumpy drew his knife and delivered a deep, precise cut to the man's arm. In the seconds that followed, Bumpy slashed the robber across the throat and abdomen, leaving him bleeding heavily on the pavement. The commotion drew the attention of a nearby police officer, but by the time he had reached the scene, Bumpy had already tossed his knife into a sewer. When questioned, Bumpy and Nat calmly insisted they arrived to find the man already wounded. The officer then turned to Pompez, but before he could get a word out, Bumpy stepped forward and cut him off, explaining that Pompez didn't speak English. The officer, already on edge, tried to push past him, but Bumpy held his ground and barked at Nat to get Pompez into the car and drive. As Nat sped away with the banker safely inside, the scene boiled over. The officer grabbed Bumpy, and a violent struggle broke out, ending only when 3 more policemen rushed in to pin him to the pavement. By then, Pompez and Nat were long gone. Bumpy was charged with assaulting a police officer, resisting arrest, and attempted murder, charges made possible because the wounded robber, against all odds, survived. Yet the incident quickly spread through Harlem, enhancing Bumpy's growing reputation. More importantly, it earned him the gratitude of Pompez, who had narrowly avoided the kind of public scandal that could have threatened both his legitimate and illicit ventures. To show his appreciation, Pompez hired a prominent attorney for Bumpy, and the lawyer succeeded in reducing the charges to simple disorderly conduct. Bumpy received only a year of probation. The newspapers seized on the story, and his notoriety grew beyond the neighborhood. But at home, the reaction was far less celebratory. Mabel was deeply troubled by her brother's rising fame in the underworld, and the publicity surrounding the incident brought new strain to their already fragile relationship. Trouble returned to Harlem only a few months later, this time in a far more violent and unpredictable form. One evening in 1924, a dice game hosted by Bumpy's close friend Finley Hoskins, a sharp, dependable member of Bumpy's crew, was underway in the basement of 129 West 134th Street. Among the players was Julius Used to Prosperity. This felt like the one chance worth taking. For years, the policy bankers who oversaw these operations had grown wealthy with minimal interference. Local police captains accepted payoffs and continued to view the game as harmless. A modest vice tucked inside barber shops and sweet stores played quietly by people with little influence. But as Harlem's profits expanded, so did the attention they drew. Reports of the neighborhood's growing wealth moved steadily upward, first to higher-ranking police officials, then to politicians in Tammany Hall, and eventually to the major criminal organizations that operated downtown. The numbers game was no longer being ignored. Throughout the Prohibition era, Irish, Italian, and Jewish gangs had focused their energy on the far more lucrative liquor trade. They built hidden breweries in abandoned warehouses, smuggled whiskey across the Canadian border, and operated speakeasies and nightclubs, including many in Harlem. Liquor had become a billion-dollar industry, and the rising numbers game seemed insignificant by comparison. It had become clear for all to see that Prohibition hadn't truly outlawed alcohol. Americans weren't going to stop drinking simply because the government told them to, and instead of drying the country out, the law had handed organized crime the opportunity of a lifetime. Bootleggers, rum runners, and syndicates built empires supplying a demand that never wavered. And even the government eventually had to accept what the streets already knew. The experiment had failed. So, as the 1930s began, and with the end of Prohibition now plainly on the horizon, those same syndicates turned their attention elsewhere. The very criminal kingpins who dismissed the numbers game as insignificant throughout the 1920s were now circling back, eager to carve out a slice of Harlem's lucrative policy racket for themselves. Among the men now eyeing Harlem's wealth was Dutch Schultz, a gangster so violent and unpredictable that even New York's hardened criminals feared crossing him. He ruled the Bronx liquor trade with an iron fist, leaving a trail of bodies wherever he expanded. And now he was coming for Harlem's numbers, not to share, not to partner, but to own it outright. By 1931, the beer baron of the Bronx, as Schultz was known, was one of New York's richest and most feared gangsters. His breweries pumped out millions of gallons of beer a year. His trucks ran day and night, and his lieutenants collected envelopes from every saloon between the Harlem River and the Grand Concourse. His violence was legendary and his power absolute. And then one day, it all collapsed. Prohibition, the law that had made him a king, was repealed. Overnight, the breweries fell silent. The trucks stopped. The speakeasies went legitimate. Dutch was left with muscle, money, and a small army of gunmen, but no product to move. For the first time since his rise, Dutch was restless. He was a violent man, but not a foolish one. He knew he needed a new revenue stream, something steady, untaxed, and immune to government repeal. That was when his lawyer, Dixie Davis, came to him with an idea. Davis was no ordinary attorney. He was a bent, sharp-minded fixer, the kind of lawyer who kept bootleggers, bookmakers, and small-time racketeers out of jail for the right price. And in Harlem, he represented every major policy banker, apart from Stephanie Street. Clair, he knew their books, their habits, their fears, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. Davis laid it out to Schultz bluntly. The policy bankers aren't gangsters, he told Dutch. They're gamblers running an illegal business on a peaceful, nonviolent basis. In other words, they're easy prey. Davis laid out the logic. Schultz controlled the Bronx. Every crooked politician, every police captain whose palm he greased, every saloon, every street, and the Bronx shared its southern border with Harlem, where the numbers game thrived. Economically, the two worlds were night and day. Harlem's bankers had money, but no real protection. With Bumpy in prison, Bub Hewlett was the only real force in Harlem. But Schultz was on a whole another level of viciousness than Bub Hewlett. Together, Davis said they could build something bigger than anything beer had ever offered. He described the numbers racket like a man reciting scripture. Elegant, cash-based, invisible. No warehouses, no trucks, no seizures. The odds guaranteed profit. The players stayed loyal, and the police looked the other way for the right price. Schultz didn't need much persuasion. He didn't need charts or ledgers. He had spent a decade reading a city by instinct, alone. Harlem was covered in storefronts and corner shops where money moved quietly from hand to hand. Barber shops, newsstands, candy stores, pool rooms. Every one of them was a miniature bank collecting wages from morning until night. To Schultz, it looked less like a neighborhood and more like an untapped revenue stream running straight through Manhattan. The Bronx had given him wealth, but Harlem promised something different, continuity. A business that couldn't be repealed or voted out of existence. And so the fragile calm that had protected the numbers racket for years was beginning to crack. The beer baron of the Bronx was heading south, and Harlem's policy kings were about to learn what happened when Dutch Schultz fixed his gaze on new territory. And Schultz did not come south alone. He brought with him his two most feared henchmen, Bo Weinberg, his icy, calm chief enforcer, and Abe Landau, a volatile gunman whose reputation alone could empty a room. Together, they began applying pressure to Harlem's policy bankers, men who were gamblers and businessmen, not gangsters, and therefore utterly unprepared for the kind of violence that Schultz used to take over the Bronx. One by one, Harlem's biggest bankers fell in line. Henry Miro folded first, followed by Big Joe Isbrund, and eventually Alex Pompezes gave Dutch 70% of his bank after Dutch held a pistol to his head in Pomp's cigar shop. And even the legendary Casper Holstein, once the most powerful policy king in the neighborhood, also relented under Dutch's pressure. Within 3 months, Schultz had broken nearly every major operation in Harlem. Only one banker refused to bow, Madame Street Clair, the queen of policy. In 1931, Madame Street Clair received an unexpected visit from Bub Hewlett. Once her trusted ally, Bob had become a key figure in Dutch Schultz's Harlem campaign. Schultz had known from the beginning that if he wanted to conquer the numbers racket, he needed someone already rooted in Harlem's underworld. Some watchman's organization boasted around 100 men, but Bumpy was not reckless. He understood the terrain, and he understood Harlem. The majority of Schultz's enforcers were white, and white men stood out immediately in the neighborhood. Bumpy used this to his advantage. Schultz's men were ambushed in hallways, dragged from taxis, shot through car windows, or discovered floating in the Harlem River. Each attack chipped away at Schultz's presence, turning Harlem's own streets into a battleground. Bub Hewlett and his crew proved far more difficult to confront because they knew Harlem as well as Bumpy did, and eventually the inevitable happened. Bumpy and Bub crossed paths. The confrontation erupted into a storm of gunfire that left both men severely wounded and hospitalized. In the months that followed, the violence escalated. More than 40 men were killed in the fighting. Most of them Schultz's soldiers who found themselves unmatched and outmaneuvered in a territory that was not their own. Policy banks on both sides were bombed. Runners were killed. Bankers were taken hostage. And for a time, the violence seemed endless. But in late 1933, it stopped almost overnight. But Hewlett, Dutch Schultz's eyes, ears, and personal Harlem tour guide, the man who made his takeover possible, was arrested on a grand larceny charge and convicted. The crime was minor compared to the terror he'd unleashed uptown, but the sentence was not 5 years, and it was long enough to shatter Schultz's foothold in Harlem. The effect was felt immediately. With Bob gone, his men scattered. Schultz's soldiers suddenly, without their guide, were blind on streets they barely understood. Harlem's alleys, rooftops, and back rooms belonged to locals, not to outsiders from the Bronx. Within weeks, most of Schultz's crew had retreated back across the river, leaving Harlem in the hands of those who knew it best. Street Clair and Bumpy had done what few believed possible. They'd beaten Dutch Schultz back out of Harlem, but peace in the neighborhood was always temporary, and Dutch was not finished testing its limits. In late 1934, he imported a new enforcer from Chicago, a black gunman named Ulysses Rollins, who strutted up and down 7th Avenue, boasting that he was Dutch Schultz's new muscle and that he had come to Harlem for one purpose: to kill Bumpy Johnson. It was a reckless move, a provocation as blatant as it was dangerous, and everyone knew it would end in blood. And the confrontation came quickly. In June 1934, Bumpy was sitting in a small restaurant on the corner of 126th Street and 7th Avenue when Rollins walked through the door. Witnesses said that the two men locked eyes, and before a word was spoken, Bumpy's switchblade flashed. He crossed the room in a blur and slashed Rollins 36 times before the man could even reach for his gun. The floor ran slick with blood. Rollins was left barely alive. Doctors removed one of his eyes and patched together what they could, assuming the matter was finished. It wasn't. That same night, half-blind and staggering, his body held together by bandages, Rollins slipped out of the hospital and went hunting for Bumpy Johnson. He found him at the Alhambra Grill, the grand restaurant that still stands today on 7th Avenue. Rollins burst through the door, raised his gun, and fired. The bullet tore through Bumpy's hat, missed his skull by an inch, and struck a woman behind the counter. Her name was Meline Glass. She was a long-time waitress at the Alhambra, and she was killed instantly. An off-duty police officer eating nearby wrestled Rollins to the ground before he could fire again. He was arrested on the spot. The mugshot taken that night still survives. A gaunt, wild-eyed man with one eye, his face scrolled over in ink by a tired clerk. The killing of Meline Glass shocked Harlem. For months, the community had endured shootings, stabbings, kidnappings, and disappearances. But this was different. This was an innocent woman caught in a feud she had nothing to do with. It was the moment Harlem realized it had reached its limit. Worried not to target the bankers who had supported Bumpy and Madame Street Clair during the conflict with Schultz, he did, however, insist that the Mafia would establish new banks in Harlem, but he made a promise in return. Nothing would operate in Harlem without Bumpy's approval, and no rackets would move money through the neighborhood without his share. Bumpy Johnson emerged from the Harlem numbers war transformed. He wasn't simply an enforcer anymore, nor just a strategist moving pieces from the shadows. He had become something larger, a man whose name carried weight from 110th Street to the river, a figure Harlem now looked to as its protector. The victory reshaped his life almost overnight. In clubs along 7th Avenue, musicians, actors, and promoters crossed the room to greet him. In restaurants, waiters pulled out chairs before he reached the table. People who barely knew him suddenly introduced themselves warmly, eager to align with the man who had now taken the crown as the boss of Harlem. For Bumpy, who had grown up in the shadows of Charleston's cruelty and carved his place into Harlem, one fight at a time, that recognition mattered. Their pride mattered, and it marked the beginning of the next chapter in his life. The moment he stepped out from behind Madame Queen's shoulders and became, in the eyes of Harlem, the man in charge, Harlem's numbers scene settled into an uneasy peace after Schultz's death. The Italians had installed Trigger Mike Coppola to oversee the old Schultz-controlled lines, and uptown it became quietly understood that nothing moved in Harlem without Bumpy Johnson's consent. It wasn't a partnership, and it wasn't a friendship. It was a balance thin as glass held together only because both sides understood exactly what breaking it would cost. But being the boss of Harlem never meant the Italians stopped testing the edges. They still probed for weaknesses, nudged at borders, and tried their luck wherever they thought Bumpy wasn't watching. One afternoon, word reached him that an Italian crew had attempted to muscle in on a small numbers bank under his protection. The banker, terrified, went straight to Bumpy. Bumpy's response was immediate and unmistakable. He called a meeting of every policy banker, collector, runner, and controller in Harlem, an unprecedented gathering that made clear just how far his reach now extended. What followed was even more powerful than gunfire. The next morning, half the runners working Italian lines didn't show up. The ones who did brought in a pitiful day's take. Harlem had gone silent, not from fear, but from loyalty. The message was unmistakable. Harlem belonged to Harlem. No one, not even the Mafia, could make money uptown without Bumpy Johnson's cooperation. As a result, Lucky asked to speak with him. And that afternoon, Bumpy walked into Luciano's suite at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where the soft carpets and polished walnut felt a world apart from Lenox Avenue. Luciano opened calmly. "What's going on uptown?" He said nothing much, Bumpy replied. "I hear the money's not too good lately." "Really, that's bad. Anything I can do to help?" Luciano set the polite tone aside. "We're businessmen. Let's talk straight. If you've got a problem, you bring it to me. I fix it." Bumpy leaned forward. "We already had an understanding. You don't move against independent policy bankers." Luciano shrugged. "This man owes us money. If he owes us money, he belongs to us." But Bumpy shook his head. "No. If there's a problem with one of my people, you come to me. You run the rest of New York, and I respect that. But Harlem's mine. I never touch one of your friends." "You're a man who deserves respect, but so am I." Luciano held his gaze for a long moment and then nodded once. "I recognize that, Bumpy, and I give respect. Jew, Irishman, Negro, it doesn't matter. We're all here to make money. Then let's keep it that way." The tension eased. They struck an agreement. The Italians would back off the banker under Bumpy's protection, and Bumpy would ensure the man paid his debt. After this, Luciano and Bumpy soon developed a genuine fondness for one another, strengthened in part by a shared passion for chess. Both were formidable players, and their matches often grew fiercely competitive. On several occasions, Luciano even ventured uptown to Harlem to play Bumpy at his favorite spot in front of the YMCA on 135th Street, which had opened only a few years earlier, was the first time that people began referring to him as the Godfather of Harlem. And the Godfather of Harlem's return to public life was immediate after the matter with the Italians was sorted. Clubs, restaurants, after-hours joints. He moved through Harlem with the ease of a man whose name still carried weight in every corner of the neighborhood. He mingled with prize fighters, musicians, and the city's rising stars, including Sugar Ray Robinson, then the undefeated king of boxing and the most glamorous athlete in America. Harlem embraced Bumpy as if he had never left. And he wasn't just back, he was back in charge. One evening in 1948, Bumpy stepped into a Harlem restaurant called the Clam House at 146 West 133rd Street with Nat Pettigrew, and his attention immediately settled on a young woman seated alone. Her name was Mamie Hatcher. Struck by her beauty, he walked over to her table and politely asked to join her. The connection was immediate. She had only recently moved to Harlem and was staying a friend while she found her footing. Beyond her looks, Bumpy was captivated by her intelligence, her gentle demeanor, and the quiet elegance with which she carried herself. For her part, Mamie found his confidence understated rather than brash, and appreciated the respect he showed her from the moment he sat down. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and the mutual attraction was unmistakable. She accepted his invitation to dinner the following night, and within weeks the two were rarely apart. Bumpy was in love, and in Mamie he had found someone who he trusted instinctively, someone whom he could speak openly in ways that he'd never with anyone else. Their courtship unfolded quickly, and 6 months later they were married. Mamie moved into Bumpy's apartment on 135th Street, bringing together their families, Bumpy's daughter, Elise, and Mamie's daughter, Ruthie, from a previous marriage. Their relationship was a study in contrast because Bumpy was tough, feared, and shaped by a life of violence, whereas Mamie was poised, warm, and composed, and earned Harlem's respect through the dignity with which she navigated a world that could be volatile and unforgiving. Even the Mafia figures who dealt with Bumpy extended courtesy to her, and despite the chaos that often surrounded her husband, she stood by him with unwavering loyalty, defending him publicly and privately alike. In Mamie, the king of Harlem had found his queen, one whose presence balanced the turbulence of his world and grounded the man behind the legend. As the 1950s began, Harlem's underworld was shifting once again. The numbers racket still stood as the neighborhood's primary economy, but a new trade was quietly taking root in the shadows: heroin. In the years after World War II, and especially as soldiers returned home from service in Japan and Korea, stories circulated about the drug's availability overseas and the profits it could bring back home. By the early 1950s, a steady trickle of narcotics was flowing into Harlem through independent couriers, small-time traffickers, and a handful of mafia-connected pipelines. It was nothing like the highly organized heroin networks that would define the 1960s and 70s, but it was growing, dangerous, chaotic, and impossible to ignore. Rumors circulated freely, and in Harlem, rumor was often treated as fact. Anyone with influence, visibility, or power could be accused of involvement, whether they touched the drug or not. Federal agents eager to make headlines during the early years of the narcotics crackdown often blurred the lines between evidence and suspicion. Bumpy Johnson understood heroin better than most men in Harlem. Not just the devastation it caused, but the machinery behind it. By June 1950, he was no longer simply taxing the trade or tolerating it on his streets. He was controlling it. He never touched the drug himself. He never bagged it, cut it, or carried it. But he controlled the routes, the couriers, the payments, and the distribution. And by the end of 1951, he had become one of the city's most important channels for high-grade heroin entering New York, cementing his reputation as the Godfather of Harlem. The heroin he moved came from the same source that supplied almost every dealer in New York during that era, the French Connection. The chain worked like a machine. Opium grown in Turkey was processed into morphine base, smuggled into Marseille, and refined in Corsican-run laboratories into some of the purest heroin in the world. From there, it traveled to New York hidden in mail bags, false-bottom suitcases, diplomatic pouches, or sealed inside cargo on ocean liners. Once it reached the docks, the Italian-American Mafia handled distribution across the city. But Harlem was different. Harlem had its own order, and Bumpy, through leverage, negotiation, and the force of his reputation, carved out a slice of that pipeline for himself. He didn't control the French labs, and he didn't command the ships, but he controlled what entered Harlem. He bypassed certain Italian middlemen entirely, asserting his authority over the uptown end of the trade in a way that few black traffickers had ever managed, and he took him under his wing, much like Bub Hewlett had done with him. First came small errands, then trusted responsibilities, and before long, Flash was living in Bumpy's home, eating at his table, and by his side in private meetings. Few men in Harlem ever stood so close to Bumpy Johnson. But the relationship ended with a violence that shocked even Bumpy's own inner circle. When he learned Flash had behaved inappropriately with his daughters, Elise and Ruthie, he reacted instantly. In broad daylight in the middle of Harlem, he beat Flash and threw him out of his home, warning him never to come near his family or near Harlem again. Humiliated and burning for revenge, Flash did the one thing that could hurt Bumpy most. He walked into the offices of federal narcotics agents and offered himself as a witness. From that moment on, the case began to take shape, a case Flash helped build from scraps, inventions, and lies. He claimed he'd been Bumpy's courier since 1949. He described meetings, handoffs, and shipments that actually never happened. Agents fed him details to refine the stories. They wanted a Harlem kingpin, and Flash wanted revenge. In 1951, after months of stings, informant testimony, and pressured witnesses, Bumpy Johnson was arrested on heroin trafficking and drug conspiracy charges. The trial became a spectacle. An addict caught selling half an ounce was pushed to claim he worked for Bumpy. Another agent testified that Bumpy sold him $400 worth of heroin in a restaurant. Flash repeated his story from the stand as if it was scripture. To Bumpy, the case appeared flimsy, and he believed that an acquittal was likely, but the jury saw it differently. He was convicted on all counts. In a desperate attempt to sway the outcome before sentencing, Bumpy offered a $100,000 bribe to the judge through his old friend Eddie Smalls, but the judge refused. In June 1953, Bumpy was sentenced to 15 years in prison and transferred to Alcatraz to serve his term. He appealed his conviction all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but the court declined to hear the case. The doors closed behind him once more, and Bumpy Johnson, who had survived Harlem streets, Dutch Schultz, and the Italian mob, now faced the one opponent he could not outfight, federal time. By June 1953, prison was nothing new to Bumpy Johnson, but this sentence would become the most revealing of his life. What unfolded over the next decade wasn't merely a man doing time. It was a man wrestling with his pride, his anger, and a betrayal that he never quite recovered from. From the beginning, his record showed trouble. At Leavenworth, where he first began serving his term, the warden described him as a bombastic, egocentric extrovert of superior intelligence, but also volatile and inclined towards assaultive behavior. The contradictions were familiar to anyone who had known him in Harlem. Brilliant, calculating, and loyal, yet always carrying a fuse that burned a little too close to the flame. In April 1954, he was transferred to Alcatraz, and the tension inside him only sharpened. Fights broke out in his first few months on the Rock, and officers moved him repeatedly in an attempt to manage him. In 1958, hoping to be closer to May and receive more regular visits, he asked for a transfer to Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. Instead, that December, he was sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. The warden there found him openly defiant and recommended that he be sent back to Alcatraz, followed him, and now celebrated his return. After 10 long years, the Godfather of Harlem was home, and Harlem made sure that the whole city knew it. The Italians had taken over the heroin trade in Harlem and the rest of New York now, and Bumpy knew that unlike last time, moving against them now would be a death sentence. However, he wasted no time in reestablishing himself. He stepped back into the numbers business with the confidence of someone picking up a familiar rhythm. But he also broadened his efforts into legitimate ventures. Wary to not leave Maine without a husband for another 10 years, he opened an exterminating company, Palmetto Chemicals, on 2nd Avenue in East Harlem, and entered into a partnership with Henry Perkins, eventually owning half of Perkins Club, Perk's Restaurant and Jazz Club on Manhattan Avenue. For the first time, Bumpy looked like he was trying to balance the underworld with legitimate business, something rooted in the day-to-day life of Harlem rather than the shadows he lived in for decades. Yet Harlem had changed, and so had the people around him. His old world was thinner now. Nat Pettigrew took charge of the heroin operation, but he had been arrested while Bumpy was inside and had been locked away on a long narcotics sentence with extra years added on top, and he wouldn't see daylight again for another 10 years himself. Junie Bird had gone legit, and other familiar faces had retired, moved on, or simply disappeared into the same violence that had shaped them all. Harlem welcomed Bumpy home. But the neighborhood he returned to was not the one that he had left. Soon after his release, Bumpy moved his family into Lenox Terrace, the brand-new $20 million residential complex that city officials hailed as Harlem's greatest urban renewal success. Built on what had once been one of the neighborhood's bleakest slums, Lenox Terrace stretched from 5th Avenue to Lenox Avenue, between 132nd and 135th Street, its 6-story towers still under phased construction. When Bumpy arrived, offered amenities unheard of in Harlem housing. Gold-braided doormen, private balconies, oversized living rooms, modern elevators, landscaped courtyards, and rent as high as $190 a month for a 5-room apartment with 2 bathrooms. It was luxury by Harlem standards or anyone else's. Moving there signaled something important. Bumpy wasn't drifting back into his old life. He was stepping into a new Harlem where success was finally visible in brick, glass, and steel. From Lenox Terrace, he rebuilt the daily rhythm of his public life. His unofficial headquarters became 22 West, a restaurant and gathering spot known for its late-night crowds and its mix of political figures, musicians, hustlers, activists, and the local elite. Bumpy kept a booth in the back, a kind of open-air office where he held court from afternoon until well past midnight. Anyone who needed him knew to find him there. Politicians came quietly to ask for help, securing the black vote. Gang captains arrived to settle disputes before they escalated. Ordinary residents approached him for loans, intervention, or advice. Bumpy listened, measured each request, and more often than not, acted. For many in Harlem, he remained the person who would step in when no one else would. 22 West was also where he rekindled his friendship with Malcolm X in early 1964, when Malcolm was still a minister in the Nation of Islam, and building a reputation as Harlem's sharpest orator. Malcolm and Bumpy had known each other since 1942, when Malcolm worked as a waiter at Small's Paradise. Their respect for one another deepened over time, and after Malcolm left the nation, Bumpy quietly supported him, seeing in him a courage and moral clarity that reminded Bumpy of the Harlem that he had spent a lifetime defending. Malcolm's assassination in 1965 devastated him, especially knowing how Malcolm had refused Bumpy's protection for fear that it would be used against him. By the mid-1960s, Harlem was shifting again, and Bumpy saw the change coming long before most. The numbers still made him money, and although his heroin interest had long since been absorbed by the Mafia, a new drug market, faster, cleaner, more portable, was beginning to take hold. Cocaine was becoming fashionable. Bumpy moved into the trade with the same discipline and distance he'd maintained with heroin. He never touched the drug himself. He never cooked it, cut it, or carried it. But he controlled the pipeline through a network of Peruvian contacts, dealers and exporters, operating out of Lemur in the Central Highlands, related to Peruvians he knew from Harlem. He established a direct route into New York. Couriers flew into Idlewild Airport with false-bottom suitcases, swallowed capsules, or wore custom-tailored garments lined with cocaine packets. Others traveled through Havana, Santo Domingo, or Port-au-Prince, repackaging shipments onto cargo vessels headed for Brooklyn and the Manhattan docks. A bribe to the right longshoreman, a friendly face in the customs office, and the crates moved through untouched. Once the cocaine reached Harlem, Bumpy oversaw everything. Who cut it, who bagged it, who sold it, and which corners were permitted to operate. Just like with the heroin, he insulated himself completely from the physical product, placing layers of runners, baggers, lieutenants, and accountants between himself and the narcotics. If law enforcement ever seized a package or arrested a courier, it never led back to him. His direct importation from Peru was a deliberate bypass of the Italian middlemen who believed that they controlled the whole of New York's narcotics traffic. It was bold, provocative, and guaranteed to cause friction. But Bumpy Johnson had never been the sort of man who waited for permission. Harlem was evolving, and he intended to claim his share of the new order. But even as he expanded his reach, his body began issuing warnings that he could no longer ignore. In February 1967, whilst leaning against his Cadillac on 7th Avenue, he suddenly collapsed. The pain was sharp and crushing. It was a heart attack. A Detroit dealer named Charlie Cole happened to be walking past and rushed him to Harlem Hospital. Bumpy survived, but only months later, another heart attack struck while he was sitting in a small restaurant on 125th Street. He recovered again, but this time not without recognizing that the years were beginning to take something from him. Still, once he was back on his feet, he returned to work with the same resolve that had carried him through every battle of his life. But now, federal scrutiny was tightening. In June 1967, DEA agents swarmed him outside Lenox Terrace. He tried to slip back into his car. Instinct, not strategy. But they pulled him out and arrested him after a brief struggle. Newspapers soon splashed headlines about a false-bottom suitcase used to ferry cocaine into the country. 5 Peruvian associates were indicted alongside him. Bumpy posted the $50,000 bail, but privately he believed the bust was no coincidence. Someone almost certainly within the Italian Mafia had tipped off the feds. The indictment did little to slow him. He continued running his numbers operations, overseeing his legitimate businesses, and holding court at his usual restaurant booth as though nothing had changed. Bumpy also remained a pivotal figure in Harlem's political world. City officials recognized his ability to steady neighborhoods that could erupt far beyond their control. His authority ran deeper than the laws and operated on a level that no politician could duplicate. That truth became undeniable in April 1968, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Across the country, cities erupted. Washington, Chicago, Newark, Detroit, Los Angeles, Harlem. Roar with grief and anger was moments away from joining them when Mayor John Lindsay arrived to address the crowds. He was greeted with a storm of rocks and bottles, and Harlem was ready to explode. But local leaders urged the mayor to contact someone who could actually calm the streets. So he reached out to Bumpy. When he stepped forward beside Lindsay, the change was instant. The crowd quietened. The rocks stopped. No fires broke out. No stores were looted. While cities across America burned for days, Harlem settled by the next morning. It was one of the clearest displays of Bumpy Johnson's complicated but undeniable power. In a moment when grief, injustice, and rage threatened to swallow the neighborhood whole, Harlem listened to him. Feared by many, respected by more, he remained even in the twilight of his life, a stabilizing force in a world that rarely offered one. On the night of July the 7th, 1968, Bumpy Johnson walked into Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue with Junie Bird, the friend who had been beside him since their teenage days, running the streets of Harlem. It was a quiet Sunday evening, and the place was calm in that familiar Wells way. Waitresses calling to one another, the scent of fried chicken drifting through the air, conversations humming low across the booths. Bumpy didn't order anything extravagant. Just a coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits, his usual comfort meal. The two men talked as they always did, slipping easily between gossip, business memories, and the small rhythms of Harlem life that both had known for nearly half a century. Then something shifted. In the middle of a sentence, Bumpy paused. He looked directly at Junie as if trying to focus through a sudden fog. His hand moved instinctively towards his chest. A moment later, he sank sideways in the booth. Junie caught him just before he hit the floor. Later, Junie told Mamie that in those final seconds, Bumpy's face softened, not in fear, but in something like recognition, as if he understood perfectly what was happening. He gave a small, familiar smile, let out a quiet laugh, almost like an exhale, and then his eyes closed. By the time the ambulance arrived, the Godfather of Harlem was dead, aged 62. Harlem's farewell was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Thousands flooded the streets for his funeral at St. Martin's Church on 122nd Street and Lenox Avenue. The crowd was so large and the emotions so raw that the police posted officers with shotguns on nearby rooftops to prevent any outbreak of violence or chaos. Some of the celebrities who had once stood close to him kept their distance, unwilling to risk being photographed at the funeral of a man still under a federal narcotics indictment. Harlem newspapers called them cowards, and they weren't wrong, but many others came. Sugar Ray Robinson, Joe Louis, Count Basie, Eddie Smalls, Finley Hoskins, Nat Pettigrew, Tony Salerno, and even a 71-year-old Madame Stephanie Street. Clair, by now long retired from the rackets, all came to pay their respects. We're all there. Jazz singer Billy Daniels stepped forward and sang My Buddy. His voice filled the church with a stillness so complete that even the restless murmurs in the back rows fell silent. People cried openly. Others bowed their heads. The song seemed to hang in the air long after the last note faded. Then Reverend John H. Johnson delivered a eulogy that captured the contradictions of the man that Harlem was laying to rest. He chose his course, and he followed it with his eyes open. In a world filled with social contamination and doubled talk, maybe there was no other way to be a man. It was the truth. Bumpy Johnson had lived exactly as he'd intended to live when he first stepped foot in Harlem, and made that promise to himself fiercely, defiantly, and without apology. It was a fitting farewell for a man who'd lived and died on his own terms. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed the full tale of Bumpy Johnson. It's certainly a fascinating one. If you did enjoy the video, then please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you do want to see more stories like this. And once again, thanks so much for watching, and I shall see you in the next one.